As the ships sailed away from the island, the settlers were forced to confront the truth. The Dodo had been the island's last line of defense against the chaos they had caused. In their quest for control, they had overlooked the simple truth that they were part of the ecosystem too. They had believed that they could harness nature, bend it to their will, but nature had ultimately bent them. The rats and pigs they had brought with them, initially seen as nothing more than an inconvenience, had turned into agents of destruction, and the dodos, the innocent and harmless creatures they had once hoped to protect, had paid the price for the settlers' ignorance. Days turned into weeks, and the memories of the island's tragic fall began to fade into the background of the settlers' lives. But the guilt remained, a constant reminder of their failure. They had set out to conquer the island, to claim it as their own, but in the end it was the island that had claimed them. They would never forget the dodo, the bird whose extinction had come at their hands, and whose loss had sealed the fate of the land they had tried so hard to control. Years later, when the story of the dodo and the settlers' failed attempt at colonization was passed down through generations, it became a cautionary tale. The dodo's extinction was no longer just a tragedy for one species, but a symbol of humanity's tendency to act without fully understanding the consequences of their actions. The settlers had come to the island with noble intentions, but their failure to respect the delicate balance of nature had cost them dearly. The story of the dodo lived on, not just in history books, but in the lessons learned from its demise. It served as a reminder that humans are not separate from nature, but rather a part of it. The dodo's fall was a warning that no matter how powerful humanity becomes, there are forces beyond their control, forces that must be respected, or else the consequences will be dire. And so, as the settlers returned to their homeland, the island that had once promised them a future became a distant memory. The legacy of the dodo, however, would live on in the hearts and minds of all who heard its story. It would remind them that, no matter how hard we try to shape the world around us, we must always remember that we are guests in nature's house, not its masters. In the end, the dodo's extinction was not just the end of a species, but the end of an era. It marked the moment when humanity realized that their relationship with the natural world was not one of domination, but of coexistence. The settlers may have failed to save the dodo, but in their failure they found a lesson that would echo through time. The island, now forever changed, continued to drift in the vast ocean, untouched by the hands of men, a reminder of the fragile nature of life and the delicate balance that sustains it. The dodo story, though tragic, left behind a powerful legacy. It was a story of innocence lost, but also a story of hope. The hope that in learning from our mistakes, we might one day find a way to live in harmony with the world around us. As the settlers sailed away, they realized that the island's true lesson was not just about the dodo. It was about the future of all life on Earth. And perhaps in the years to come, humanity would finally learn that lesson. But for now, as the island faded from view, the settlers were left with nothing but the haunting memory of what they had lost and the quiet knowledge that the dodo was gone forever. Just one more casualty in the ongoing battle between humanity and the natural world. The dodo, once a symbol of innocence and helplessness, was now gone, its species lost forever. The realization hit like a gut punch. The settlers had not only failed to protect the birds, they had inadvertently sealed their fate. In their eagerness to capitalize on the dodo's survival, they had been too late to act, too slow to recognize that the island's ecosystem had already turned against them. The men stood in stunned silence, the weight of their actions sinking in. The island, the very place they had come to conquer and build upon, had stripped away the last remnants of the dodo in a final tragic irony. They had arrived as the saviors, but they were now the unwitting destroyers. The animals that had caused so much damage, the rats and pigs, had done their work while the settlers distracted themselves with the thought of profit. But as they began to turn away from the wreckage, a strange realization crept in. What if the dodos weren't the only ones who had been pushed to the brink? The island, once a paradise of balance, had begun to change in ways that the settlers hadn't expected. The plants the dodos once tended to had started to wither without the birds' help, and the island's delicate ecosystems were unraveling. The settlers' very presence had tipped the scales of nature, and the consequences were now beginning to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. And just as they thought the worst was over, an unexpected figure emerged from the forest's edge. It wasn't a settler, but a wild boar, its eyes wide with hunger. The boar, his body tense and ready for a fight, charged toward the group. But before they could react, the ground beneath them seemed to shift, as if the island itself had stirred in anger. The once safe sanctuary had become a battleground for survival, and the settlers, for all their ingenuity, were no longer the top of the food chain. In the midst of the chaos, as the boar charged and the settlers scrambled to defend themselves, a strange thought flickered through their minds. The Dodos were gone, but the island had survived them. The balance had tipped, and now it was the settlers' turn to face the consequences. The Dodo's extinction wasn't the end of the island's story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where nature took its revenge for the destruction wrought by human hands. As the settlers retreated, battered and bloodied, they realized the truth too late. The island was no longer a place for them to conquer. It was a place where they were just another part of the ecosystem, vulnerable to the very forces they had disrupted. The last of the Dodos had been wiped out, but the story of their fall and the island's shifting fate had only just begun. And as the settlers fled back to their ships, they knew they had learned a harsh lesson. Paradise, once lost, would never truly be reclaimed. The settlers, bruised and battered, made their way back to the ships, their footsteps heavy with regret and guilt. The island, once a place of hope and promise, had become a symbol of human folly. As they reached the shore and gazed out at the water, the vast expanse of the ocean before them felt more like a barrier than a path forward. The silence between them was thick, the weight of the island's lessons too much to bear in words. The boat's charge had been a cruel reminder that despite all their attempts to control nature, they were not immune to its wrath. The few who still clung to the hope that the island could be reclaimed stood at the edge of the ships, watching the shoreline fade into the distance. But even they knew deep down that there was no going back. The dodo, the island's most iconic inhabitant, was gone. The land they had tried to tame would now continue without them, indifferent to their existence. Back on the island, the rats, the pigs, and the other introduced species had already begun to spread further into the ecosystem. The delicate balance that had once sustained the island's natural order had been irrevocably disrupted. The plants that had once thrived thanks to the dodo's unique relationship with them were now in danger of vanishing altogether. Some species of trees and shrubs, once vibrant and full of life, now stood as mere shadows of their former selves. The island had become a place of survival, but not for the settlers. But the changes didn't stop there. The lush forests of Mauritius, once teeming with life, began to shrink. The sailors chopped down trees for firewood and shelter, slowly stripping away the dodo's food sources and nesting grounds. The island's ecosystem, which had been in perfect harmony for so long, began to spiral out of control, and the dodos, they had no way to fight back. How could they? For millennia, they'd lived without predators, without challenges. Their bodies weren't built for speed, their minds weren't wired for suspicion, and their instincts didn't want them to fear humans or the other creatures that arrived with them. Still, the dodos continued their lives as best they could, wandering the forests in search of fruit and building their nests where they always had. Maybe they didn't even realize the danger they were in. Maybe they thought this was just another change in the rhythm of the island, a dry season, a storm, something temporary that would pass. But this time it wasn't temporary. It was the start of the end. And then there was another layer to their downfall, one that's harder to measure but just as devastating. The dodos weren't just physically vulnerable, they were symbolic. To the sailors, these birds represented abundance, indulgence, even carelessness. Early explorers told exaggerated tales of how the dodo tasted. Some said it was tough and unpleasant, others claimed it was a delicacy. But the truth didn't matter. The dodo became a story, a symbol of a wild land ripe for the taking. Its actual existence was overshadowed by its role in human imagination. As the years passed, the dodo's numbers dwindled. Entire generations disappeared before anyone even realized what was happening. There were no conservation efforts, no second chances. The people of that time didn't think about extinction in the way we do now. They didn't see the dodo as a unique species that might one day be gone forever. To them, it was just a bird that couldn't run fast, couldn't fly, and couldn't fight back. A bird that, in their eyes, was simply part of the island's bounty. But as the forest thinned and the dodos became harder to find, the island began to feel emptier. The sailors moved on, the rats, pigs, and monkeys stayed behind, and the dodo story was left in fragments. The people who had seen these birds first and lightly didn't realize they were witnessing the final chapter of a species that had once flourished in complete harmony with its environment. And yet, the story of the dodo doesn't end here. Its disappearance wasn't just a loss for Mauritius, it was a warning for the world. But what if we could go back to those early days, back to the moment when the ship's anchor first hit the water? Could things have turned out differently? Or was the dodo doomed the moment its paradise was discovered? The answers lie in the lessons we can still learn from its downfall, and perhaps in understanding why it sucked to be born as a dodo bird. We'll see how much responsibility we carry in the stories of other creatures. Stories that, unlike the dodos, aren't finished yet. As the dodo's paradise unraveled, the conflict wasn't just about survival, it was about the clash of two worlds that couldn't have been more different. On one side, the dodos lived as they always had, oblivious to the forces working against them. On the other side, humans and their invasive companions spread across the island like a storm, consuming resources with no regard for the balance they were destroying. It was a slow, creeping battle that the dodos never even knew they were fighting. Imagine for a moment the perspective of the first sailors who arrived. To them, Mauritius was an untouched Eden. They marveled at the strange creatures they encountered, birds that didn't fly and didn't seem to fear them. They must have seen the dodos as curiosities, giant, bumbling birds with conical appearances, almost too odd to be real. But novelty only lasts so long. Once the initial fascination faded, the sailors saw the dodos for what they were, a resource. Easy to catch, easy to kill, and requiring no skill to hunt. They didn't see the dodos as living beings in their own right, part of an intricate ecosystem that had taken thousands of years to evolve. They saw them as food, nothing more. But what about the animals that came along for the ride? The rats, the pigs, the monkeys, they were invaders too. But they were survivors in ways the dodos could never be. Rats are cunning, adaptable, and fast. They can climb trees, dig burrows, and find food in the unlikeliest of places. For them, Mauritius was a feast waiting to be devoured. And devour it they did, one egg at a time. The dodo's eggs, left unprotected on the ground, were no match for these relentless predators. Generations of dodos were wiped out before they even had a chance to hatch. But just as the settlers began to plan, another twist complicated matters. That very night, a violent storm swept over the island, more ferocious than any in recent memory. The winds howled, tearing through the fragile settlements and scattering livestock. Torrential rain turned the soil to mud, washing away crops and carving deep scars into the land. For days, the island was plunged into chaos, its delicate balance further destabilized by the relentless power of nature. When the storm finally subsided, the settlers emerged to assess the damage. Trees had been uprooted, homes destroyed, and rivers flooded. Yet, amidst the wreckage, something else became clear. The hidden valley, the sanctuary where the last dodos had been seen, was no longer hidden. The storm had carved a path through the forest, exposing the once secluded area to the outside world. The settlers now had an open road to the dodos, but so did the pigs, rats, and other invasive animals that had already wreaked havoc on the rest of the island. The discovery of the exposed valley caused a rift among the settlers. Some argued that they should leave the dodos alone, recognizing that they had played a part in driving the birds to the brink of extinction. Others, however, saw this as their final chance to make use of the species before it vanished completely. The debate grew heated, with tempers flaring as survival instincts clashed with the faint stirrings of guilt. Meanwhile, the dodos, unaware of the storm's consequences, continued their simple lives in the valley. But their newfound caution hadn't prepared them for what was coming. The rats, drawn by the scent of fruit and the eggs buried shallow in the ground, began to infiltrate the valley. At night, their beady eyes glittered in the moonlight as they skidded closer to the nesting grounds. The dodos, having never faced such persistent predators, were ill equipped to fend them off. As the settlers prepared to act, some eager to preserve the dodos, others determined to exploit them, a new question emerged. Was it already too late? Could the fragile balance of the valley survive both human interference and the encroaching threat of invasive species? And in the midst of this growing tension, an even darker possibility began to take shape. What if the dodos weren't the only ones at risk? What if the unraveling of their existence was just the beginning of a much larger collapse, one that would forever alter the island itself? The stakes had never been higher. On one side, the settlers faced a moral dilemma: to preserve or to take. On the other, the dodos fought an unseen battle for survival, their ancient instincts struggling against forces they couldn't understand. And hanging over it all was the realization that the fate of the dodos and the island now rested in the hands of those who had caused the destruction in the first place. The tension in the air was palpable as the settlers gathered near the valley, their faces marked by the uncertainty of the choice ahead. Some had set up camp at the edge of the valley, eager to act at a moment's notice, while others lingered in the shadows, conflicted by the moral weight of their intentions. The dodos, still blissfully unaware of the storm that had swept through their world, continued their simple routines, pecking at the ground and cooing softly. But they were not as safe as they thought. The rats had already begun to infiltrate the valley, moving swiftly under cover of darkness. The settlers, driven by their greed or guilt, made their move the following morning. A group of men armed with nets and cages ventured into the heart of the valley, their intentions clear. They would capture the dodos, protect them from the rats, and if it came down to it, take them away to the mainland. But as they reached the heart of the grove, the first shock hit. The dodos, once so oblivious, had vanished. Confusion spread quickly among the settlers. Where could they have gone? The valley had been their sanctuary, untouched by the outside world, but now it was empty, save for the faint tracks left in the mud. For hours the men scoured the area, calling out to the birds, but they were gone, leaving behind nothing but the broken remnants of their nests. And then, as the settlers continued their search, the final twist hit with all the force of a thunderclap. One of the younger men, a quiet fellow who had been exploring the farthest edges of the valley, stumbled upon something. He didn't speak at first, but when the others approached, they found him standing over a cluster of crushed eggs, their contents spilled out onto the ground. The eggs weren't just abandoned, they had been destroyed, their fragile shells shattered by force. But there was something else. Hidden beneath the debris was a single small figure, its feathers barely visible, and its body stiff with cold. But safety was an illusion. One night, under a moonlit sky, a small group of dodos nestled together in the shelter of a grove. The air was unusually still, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Suddenly there was a new sound, soft at first, then growing louder. It was the sharp rustle of something moving through the underbrush, quick and purposeful. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, then another and another. Rats, a swarm of them, their sharp noses twitching as they closed in on the unsuspecting dodos. The birds, oblivious to the danger, didn't react. They had no instincts to warn them, no fear to spur them into action. The rats descended on the nesting site, their tiny claws scrambling across the ground. Eggs were stolen in seconds, cracked open and devoured before the dodos could even register what was happening. One bird flapped its wings in confusion, a clumsy attempt to scare off the intruders, but it was no use. The rats were relentless, and the dodos, for all their size, were powerless to stop them. As dawn broke, the grove was silent once more. The dodos that remained wandered through the aftermath, his simple minds unable to comprehend the loss. But the damage was done. Another generation of dodos had been wiped out before it even began, pushing the species closer to the brink. For the settlers, the dodo's decline was little more than a footnote in their lives. They had bigger concerns: survival, trade, and building a new life on this distant island. They didn't stop to consider the role they had played in the dodo's downfall or the ripple effects it might have on the ecosystem. To them, the dodo was just one more casualty of progress, an unfortunate but insignificant consequence of humanity's expansion. And yet, even as the dodos disappeared from view, their presence lingered in strange and haunting ways. Travelers who ventured deeper into the forest spoke of an eerie stillness, a sense that something vital had been lost. They described stumbling upon abandoned nesting sites, marked by scattered feathers and cracked eggshells, as though the dodos had left behind ghostly reminders of their existence. The settlers may not have cared, but the island itself seemed to mourn. Without the dodos, certain plants struggled to grow, their seeds no longer spread by the birds foraging. The balance that had once defined Mauritius was slipping away, and with it, the very essence of the island. As the years wore on, sightings of dodos became rarer and rarer. Some settlers claimed to have seen one waddling through the trees, but these stories were often dismissed as myths or exaggerations. The truth was, no one knew how many dodos were left, if any. The birds had retreated into the farthest corners of the island, clinging to the last remnants of a world they no longer recognized. And so the question loomed: was there still hope for the dodos, or had their fate already been sealed? Could anything be done to save them, or were they destined to become a symbol of loss? A reminder of how easily paradise can slip through our fingers. Just when it seemed the dodos had all but disappeared from the island's story, a strange discovery ignited whispers among the settlers. One morning, as a group of woodcutters ventured deeper into the dense forest than ever before, they stumbled upon something unexpected: a small, secluded valley hidden from the sprawling farms and settlements. It was lush, untouched by the chaos of pigs and rats, with an eerie calm that seemed out of place on the ever changing island. And there, among the thick underbrush and wild fruit trees, they spotted movement. At first, they thought it was just their imagination, but then the unmistakable, awkward waddle of a dodo emerged from the foliage. The bird looked smaller than the ones they'd hunted in the past, its feathers duller, as though the species itself had begun to diminish in stature along with its numbers. But it was alive, and it wasn't alone. As the men pressed closer, they saw more dodos, an entire group, perhaps the last survivors of their kind. Unlike their ancestors, these dodos seemed more alert, their eyes darting nervously, as if they could sense the danger humanity brought. It was as though nature had begun to adapt, giving these birds a cautious edge their predecessors had lacked. The discovery of this hidden group set off a flurry of excitement. Word spread quickly, and the settlers, who had mostly forgotten about the dodos, now saw a new opportunity. Some whispered about capturing the birds, taming them for farms, or sending them back to Europe as curiosities. Others, more pragmatic, saw a chance to turn the remaining dodos into a resource: meat, feathers, even a potential trade commodity. For the settlers, it was a stroke of fortune. For the dodos, it marked the beginning of a final, desperate fight for survival. Imagine waking up on a lush, sun soaked island surrounded by the sound of waves gently lapping at the shore. The air is fresh, the trees are heavy with fruit, and danger seems like a faraway concept. Sounds like paradise, right? Well, for the dodo bird, this paradise was more like a ticking time bomb. These quirky, flightless creatures were once the carefree rulers of Mauritius, an island in the Indian Ocean that seemed tailor made for their slow, simple lives. But that easy, untroubled existence was exactly what made their story one of the most tragic in the natural world. Today, the dodo is remembered as the ultimate symbol of extinction. But how did it all go so horribly wrong? What was it about being born as a dodo bird that turned their peaceful lives into a nightmare? Now, let's talk about the dodos themselves. Picture a plump, waddling bird about 3 feet tall, with tiny stubby wings that were useless for flying. They weren't fast runners either, and their soft, round bodies made them an easy target for predators, if there had been any. For thousands of years, the dodo lived in blissful isolation, completely unaware of what life was like beyond their little island home. They had no natural enemies, no need to hide, and certainly no reason to evolve defense mechanisms. If food was within reach, they'd eat it. If a nest could be built on the ground, they'd build it there. Life was simple and safe, or so it seemed. But then the humans came. In the late 1500s, sailors stumbled upon the unspoiled beauty of Mauritius. For these weary travelers, the island was a treasure trove of resources. There was fresh water, edible plants, and plenty of easy to catch animals. And that's where the dodo comes in. Imagine this bird seeing a human for the first time. No fear, no flight, no fight, just curious waddling right up to them, maybe even hoping for a handout. To the sailors, the dodo wasn't just a bird, it was walking food, and they weren't the only ones who took advantage. With the ships came rats, pigs, and monkeys, animals that quickly raided dodo nests and devoured their eggs, leaving the species with little chance to reproduce. You'd think this is where the story ends, but it's just getting started. See, the dodo wasn't just unlucky, it was uniquely unprepared for survival in a world that suddenly demanded adaptability and resilience. It's almost as if the universe had set them up for failure from the start. Their size, their inability to fly, their trusting nature, all of it worked against them. And yet, these traits were perfectly suited to the world they were born into, a world that humans turned upside down in a matter of decades. So, why did it suck to be born as a dodo bird? It wasn't just the bad timing or their physical limitations. It was the harsh reality of how quickly their paradise became a trap. By the time the dodos realized they were in danger, it was already too late. Within just a century of their discovery, they were gone, wiped out forever. But what if it didn't have to be this way? What if there were signs, small cracks in the paradise they called home, that hinted at the trouble to come? And what can their story teach us about how fragile even the safest, most abundant life can be? Stick around, because this story isn't just about the dodo. It's about us. It's about what happens when we take nature for granted and what it means to survive in a world that's constantly changing. The fate of the dodo is a cautionary tale, and their legacy might hold answers to questions we're still asking today. But before we dive deeper, let's take a closer look at the moment everything started to unravel. The moment paradise began to crumble. The moment paradise began to crumble wasn't some dramatic event with crashing waves or fiery skies. It was quiet, subtle. A ship's anchor dropped into the sparkling waters of Mauritius, and with it came a ripple that would soon turn into a tidal wave of change. The sailors who stepped ashore weren't thinking about the delicate balance of the ecosystem they were entering. They were thinking about food, shelter, and survival. And when they spotted the dodo birds, lumbering and unwary, they must have thought they'd hit the jackpot. To the sailors, the dodos weren't just a food source, they were an abundant, unguarded buffet. These birds didn't run when approached. They didn't fly away in panic. They simply stood there, clueless, as the newcomers brought chaos into their world. The sailors hunted them without restraint, and in their wake, the animals they brought with them wreaked even more havoc. Rats, clever and opportunistic, quickly found the dodos' nests. The eggs, once safe in their ground level cradles, became easy meals. Wild pigs and monkeys tore through the vegetation, trampling nesting sites and devouring anything they could get their teeth into. The island, which had been the dodo sanctuary for thousands of years, began to feel like a battleground. The pigs brought their own kind of destruction. Unlike the rats, they didn't stop at eggs. They uprooted plants, trampled nests, and disrupted the delicate balance of the island's vegetation. The monkeys added chaos, stealing food and spreading seeds in all the wrong places. It wasn't just the dodos that suffered. The entire ecosystem began to collapse under the weight of these new arrivals. And in the middle of it all, the dodos kept living as they always had, unaware that their world was changing too fast for them to keep up. The sailors weren't villains in their own minds. To them, they were explorers, adventurers carving out a life in the unknown. They didn't see their actions as cruel or destructive. But what they failed to understand, or perhaps didn't care to notice, was that their very presence was rewriting the rules of life on the island. Every tree they cut, every animal they brought, every dodo they killed chipped away at a system that had been perfectly balanced for centuries. What's even more haunting is how little evidence of the dodo's existence remains today. Unlike some species that leave behind fossils or large scale imprints of their time on Earth, the dodo's story has been pieced together from scattered bones, written accounts, and the occasional illustration. It's as though the dodo was erased not just from life, but from history itself, leaving behind only the faintest traces of its once thriving population. And perhaps that's part of what makes this story so compelling, the idea that a creature could be so utterly and completely lost, both in body and memory. As the years went by, the conflict deepened, the dodos grew scarcer, the damage to their world continued. The forests that had provided them with food and shelter were slowly replaced by settlements. The sailors moved on, but the pigs and rats stayed, ensuring that even if the dodos somehow managed to adapt, their world would never be the same. And yet, the dodos didn't change. How could they? Evolution takes time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. From the outside, it might seem like the dodos were doomed from the start, too slow, too trusting, too unequipped for survival in a world that had suddenly become hostile. But the truth is, they were perfectly adapted to the lives they were meant to live. It wasn't the dodos that failed, it was the world around them that shifted too quickly for them to keep up. The story of the dodo isn't just about extinction, it's about the fragility of paradise, the unintended consequences of human actions, and the heartbreaking simplicity of a creature that was just trying to live its life. But as the last dodo took its final steps, did it sense the weight of what was happening? Did it feel the shift, the loss, the end of something that had lasted for millennia? Or was it simply another day, another search for food, unaware that it was walking into the pages of history? As the years rolled on, the island of Mauritius grew quieter, though not in the way it once had been. The rustling of leaves and the soft chirping of native birds began to fade, replaced by the grunts of pigs rooting through the underbrush and the chattering of monkeys swinging from tree to tree. The air, once filled with the rhythmic coos of dodos, now seemed empty. The dodos weren't entirely gone, not yet, but their numbers had dwindled so dramatically that even spotting one became a rare occurrence. And yet, in their innocence, the dodos didn't realize they were living on borrowed time. The sailors who had come and gone were replaced by more settlers, more ships, and more animals. By now, the once pristine island had become a crossroads for humanity's ambitions. Forests were cleared to make way for farmland, rivers were diverted, and entire ecosystems were reshaped. The settlers hardly noticed the dodos anymore. They were simply part of the background, a fading relic of a time before humans arrived. But the forces that had been set in motion years earlier continued their relentless march. The rats and pigs multiplied, unchecked, spreading across every corner of the island. It wasn't just the dodo's eggs that suffered. Plants that the birds once relied on for food were being devoured before they could bear fruit. Among the remaining dodos, life carried on as it always had, though it had grown harder. The flock that had once gathered in the hundreds now seemed to consist of scattered, lonely pairs. They still wandered through the forests, pecking at fallen fruit and nesting on the ground, but something about their movements had changed. They were slower, more deliberate, as though the weight of their shrinking world was beginning to press down on them. And yet, they didn't understand what was happening. How could they? To a dodo, the world had always been a safe place, free from predators, free from fear.